This is Andy Haynes here, as Sunita said, from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. As we've heard already, the main focus of this morning is around the work of the Sustainable Diets Working Group, which has been working on a paper on methods and metrics in sustainable diets. And what we would like to do is to get comments from you and your input into that process. So the idea is to write a paper in the peer-reviewed literature, which would set out the challenges in measuring the different dimensions of sustainable diets. This process, this consultation, will contribute to that drafting process. So we aim to make this a very open and transparent process. So if you contribute things that are come into the final paper, then your names will be acknowledged in the acknowledgements section of the paper. And we're obviously keen to get the best available evidence and the best available thinking to mold and shape this paper, which we hope will be influential in the research community. I think the background of this is familiar to many of you. There are major challenges in feeding a growing world population, which could reach 10 billion or more by the end of the century. And we know that the agriculture and food system is has major impacts on the environment. So this tension between feeding more people and reducing environmental damage from the agricultural and food system is, of course, one of the great challenges, great scientific challenges of the decades to come, to which we hope to contribute in some way. So I'm going to hand over to Edward Joy, my colleague from the London School, who's going to give you some background on this and talk to you a bit about the current thinking of the working group, where it's got to, where there are gaps, and where we would like your views and opinions to shape the agenda going forward.
Thank you very much. This is Edward Joy, London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. So we've had an introduction to the Sustainable Diets Working Group. I'd just like to say a couple of things before I start on this presentation. The first thing is this presentation has been put together since 9 p.m. last night, so please forgive any slips or errors or anything in the presentation that's not quite as slick as it should be. We had a meeting yesterday with the working group. We've had a brainstorming session, effectively, and this is the product of that. The second disclaimer I'd like to say is that this is quite early on in our thinking. There's always a balance with a consultation session. Do you hold it early and let people's views sort of guide where you go, or do you hold it late when you've got a little bit more down on paper? We've decided to go early, so please, your views will be really welcome. It will help our thinking really steer the paper. And the last disclaimer I'd like to say, there's other people's work in here that I'll be referring to. I've always put in the paper reference where it's come from. Please, if you want follow-up information on references or any of the information sources that have gone into this, please do be in touch. So where is our thinking coming from? Well, one of the first things we look at, one of the first things we notice when we look at the food system globally is that we have a problem with malnutrition. We have about 1 billion people hungry in the world and about 2.2 billion people overweight and obese. And this is partly an issue of diet. We also have about 2 billion people suffering from hidden hunger, something that you can't measure with a tape measure or weighing scales. About 2 billion people worldwide. This is some work from the Rockefeller Lancet Commission. Just some trends in things related to diets. So we've got population growing in the top left panel, poverty declining over the last couple of centuries, life expectancy growing, but then we've got to consider also that our energy use has been, over this time period, massively increasing, water use and domestication of land. And a few more metrics here as well about some of the effects of our diets and other aspects of economy and so on the physical environment. And this is just a slide. These are just examples here. This is a slide of the decline in the water table in India between 2002 and 2008. And there in northwest India, in an area that is predominantly under a rice-wheat double cropping system. We've seen a decline in the water table of about 30 centimeters per year. And this is over a time period where the rainfall was close to normal. This is some work done by Sam Myers and others, published in The Lancet in 2015. Effect of declining pollinator numbers on in panel A on NCDs and in panel B on communicable diseases, primarily through a reduction in vitamin A supply in diets. So the purpose of those slides was just to say that now, coming from a nutrition background, potentially, you might want to consider that there are other aspects to dietary choices that are going to have effects on our health. So this is the Eat Well plate for the UK, suggested by Public Health England. And one of the questions we want to ask is, what would this look like if it was a sustainable diet? What would it look like if it wasn't just coming from a nutrition perspective? And then, how would we quantify whether the proposed diets are more or less sustainable? How would we differentiate between the sustainability of different diets? So what we've done in this working group is consider the diet as our functional unit. So what we're thinking of is, how would you vary consumption to make the diet more sustainable? And we realize that this is completely entwined with production processes. So while we're saying that you can change your dietary choices to make it more sustainable, this will be very much related to production processes, and it will be, the methods and metrics will be entwined. And we also realize that this is part of a wider food system. We have aspects such as processing, we have aspects such as trade and governance of the food system. And this will, the dietary choices form part of this assessment. So we've assembled this working group on sustainable diets, and this is effectively the rationale for the group. First, that this is an area that's relatively new in the research. It's a relatively new field. There's relatively little synthesis of evidence and sharing of knowledge. A second finding, or second observation, is that the metrics relating to the physical environment have primarily been related to greenhouse gas emissions, and that's been used as an indicator of sustainability. But it's not the only thing we could or should potentially be measuring. And the third rationale, there are issues, particularly around the socio-cultural areas, perhaps around economics as well, that have also not received adequate attention. And at the moment, we could safely say that we're not really in a position to quantify trade-offs. So when we talk about changing dietary patterns, we're not really in a position to quantify trade-offs. So we wanted in this group, first of all, to review methods and metrics available to quantify the different dimensions of sustainability, identify gaps and challenges in collecting and using those metrics, and ideally to equip policymakers with the tools they need to assess the sustainability of diets and to optimize for sustainable diets. We started with this FAO definition, this quite comprehensive definition of sustainable diets. I think most people will be familiar with this and where it's come from. We have a reference to the physical environment, to the economy, accessibility of food, cultural aspects such as acceptability of diets, but obviously also that the diets must be nutritionally adequate and safe and healthy. So what we did is we split these components of the definition into 4 dimensions: nutrition, environment, economics, and then almost a catch-all category of socio-cultural and ethical. And these are some examples of the metrics that we have available to use to measure nutrition. So we can look at diets and whether or not they conform to WHO guidelines. That's one way to do it. We might use dietary diversity as a way of assessing or quantifying the nutritional adequacy of diets. And we can use disability-adjusted life years as a way, again, of quantifying health impacts of diets, whether one diet is more nutritionally adequate than another. Moving on to the economic dimension. Affordability of diets, employment in the agriculture sector and the food systems sector, and contribution of agriculture to the economy. These are all important metrics that we need to be quantifying to ensure that proposed diets can be sustainable. And then in this catch-all category, socio-cultural and ethical, dietary preferences. This is one that comes up a number of times, I think, where diets are proposed for their nutritional benefits, potential economic benefits, and massively reduced physical, environmental effects, but nobody's going to eat them. So we need to consider dietary preferences, cultural norms, aspirations, and so on. Labour, I put this here, we need to also consider the welfare of those involved in the production of our food, and animal welfare. And a lot of these, we will realize these are partly qualitative assessment metrics, and they will depend a lot on the context. And here, environmental footprints, greenhouse gas emissions, water footprints, land use, biodiversity. These are some of the metrics we can use for quantifying the sustainability of diets. So with all these metrics, we have known unknowns and unknown unknowns. And part of the job of this working group is going to be trying to define these. And I'm actually just going to pass over now to Lucas, who's going to introduce himself. But he's going to take you through a little bit about the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns of environmental indicators.
Hello, so I'm Lucas Alexandrovich. I'm a PhD student here at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And I'll be presenting some results that myself and some colleagues here today did when we performed a systematic review looking at the environmental impacts of switching from current diets to a variety of sustainable proposed diets. And just to put this into a little bit of context, so the domains that Edward talked about, this just fits into one of them. So this just looks at environmental impacts and not necessarily the economic or social-cultural impacts. So just starting with what we know, there's a strong case to be made for switching current diets. So current methods of production and the food choices we make contribute to about 1/4 of all global greenhouse gas emissions. They take up about 1/3 of all land that is potentially cultivatable, and use about 70% of all of water. And also diets are a strong driver of chronic diseases. So the latest publication from the Global Burden of Disease Network highlighted this as well, pointing that diet-related risk factors are the highest contributor to non-communicable disease. So there's been studies in this field showing that there's potential win-wins in this area, that changing diets from what we currently eat can have some health and some environmental benefits as well. But despite this, there's not a lot of action being done on combining environmental and health priorities in dietary guidelines. Excuse me. And perhaps understandably so. There's still a lot of gaps in this area, and the studies that do point to win-wins and benefits are a bit scattered in terms of they look at different countries, they look at different proposed sustainable diets. So what we did is we wanted to put this research together, put these results together, and we conducted a systematic review looking specifically at studies that calculated what happens when people shift from current average diets to a variety of sustainable alternatives. And looking specifically at greenhouse gas emissions, land use, and water use. So this is just a table of what we found. a total of 46 studies were retrieved from the literature, and among these we found 130 scenarios. And so one scenario is just a comparison of taking a baseline average diet from a country based on dietary surveys or food balance sheets, and looking at how environmental impacts would change if these diets were shifted to a proposed alternative diet, a sustainable diet. So there's 130 of these scenarios, these comparisons that we looked at. And the first thing that we found is that there's no one sustainable diet. A variety of diets were proposed, some that we're already familiar with, such as vegan and vegetarian diets, some that are already promoted from public health efforts, such as just following national dietary recommendations, or Mediterranean diets, as well as diets that have been proposed more from an environmental angle, so switching from ruminant meat, which is relatively high emissions, to monogastric meat. And this is a summary of the results we found for impacts on greenhouse gas emissions. So we found that, and this is looking at reductions, the relative reductions of switching from a baseline diet to the listed sustainable diets here. So we found that the highest benefits came from diets that really reduced ruminant intake and animal-based products the most. So the highest benefits here are from vegan diets and replacing both meat and dairy with plant-based foods. And examples of sustainable diets that had the least benefit were balanced energy intake, which was just reducing calorie intake to a recommended level, as well as replacing meat with dairy products. And this is expected as both have relatively high greenhouse gas emissions. Replacing one with the other wouldn't give too much benefit. We found similar results when we looked at land use. So again, vegan diets had the highest benefits in terms of reducing land use. And again, meat replaced by dairy had the least benefit. Impacts on water use were mixed. So we see vegetarian diets had relatively high benefits, about a 35% reduction in water use, though with one large exception being vegan diets, which had a very large increase in water use. It's almost 110%. And this just points to some of the environmental trade-offs we can get from different types of diets. So although some sustainable diets could be, or some proposed diets could be good for greenhouse gas outcomes, they may not be good for water use. And this is just pulling some of the underlying environmental data from across the studies we looked at for studies that did include it. And this looks at, rather than diets, the greenhouse gas emissions and water use for food items. And so these were used to aggregate these into a diet. So the general trends were that you see at the top the highest greenhouse gas emissions per calorie are highest for ruminant meat, and then they decrease as you go to monogastric meat, dairy, and then generally plant-based foods, with some exceptions, such as here I've picked out tomatoes, which had relatively high impacts. But this was only from one study, so if you look at vegetables and fruit in general, as an aggregate, they have relatively low impacts compared to animal-based foods. And for water use, we have mostly similar trends in that ruminants and monogastric meats have the highest water use per kilocalorie. You get a few differences, such as milk and nuts, nuts and pulses having equal or higher impacts than some animal-based foods, such as higher than poultry, higher than milk, similar to eggs. And so looking at this underlying data is kind of one way of trying to tease out some of these trends of why, for example, a vegan diet might have higher water use impacts than what a current average baseline diet has. As we're replacing animal-based products with plant-based protein sources that have higher water use, this seems to make a bit more sense. So overall, we found that environmental and health benefits were possible from adopting these alternative sustainable diets. I didn't show the health trends here, but fewer studies looked at these, but they were encouraging. And benefits were generally proportional to the amount of animal-based foods that one reduced in the diet, and particularly ruminant, meat from ruminant animals.
So just back to this slide with known unknowns, unknown unknowns. One of the things we realized as we went through and brainstormed around this topic yesterday was that with a lot of this work, it's trying to quantify the effect of diets on the environment. So physical, economic, social, cultural, and political. Something that's done less but is potentially equally important, and certainly very important, is this way around. How is the environment going to affect our diets and therefore our health, our well-being, and so on? And this is related to resilience. So resilience of diets, for example, to drought. Resilience of diets to price shocks. And resilience of diets to political disruption, trade embargoes, and so on. And this is an area that I think we all agreed was a known unknown. Resilience is not well quantified. We don't have metrics easily at our disposal to quantify whether a diet is resilient or not, and therefore whether it is sustainable. Another known unknown. We've got these metrics, just ignore the yellow arrow for now, please. We've got these metrics, and this is an important output of the research community. But in terms of using these metrics, it's very important that we contextualize them and that we normalize them. So what does this mean? Contextualize means that the metric won't have much use unless we put it into the context in which it refers to. And I'll give you an example in a minute. Normalize means we need to compare the metrics against some kind of benchmark. So the example could be greenhouse gas emissions. There's a level above which we don't want to go. Without that level, these greenhouse gas emissions that we quantify are not of any use. This contextualizing and normalizing process needs to take into account the scale at which we're looking at. So are we proposing national level sustainable diets? Are we looking at the global system? Are we going to take a very local system? It also needs to take into account population needs and therefore priorities. So I think one of the examples that came up yesterday in our working group was that maybe we don't need to concern ourselves too much with the greenhouse gas emissions of the diets of those in refugee camps. Their priorities, their needs are much more related to nutrition and health, and that's what we need to focus on. And then timescale is also a very important way of contextualizing our metrics. So are we looking at what's going to happen to this population over the next 30 years or the next 50 years? So here's an example. This comes out of a group at ETH Zurich. The red areas here are under high water stress. And you'll notice that it's very spatial, very spatially determined. So what does a water footprint of a food item mean in an area there that's shaded red versus an area that's green? So this is an important way that we need to contextualize our metrics. We need to say that the water footprint of a food item relates to the water stress in the region that it's produced. Maybe we don't mind about an extra 100 litres here or there in an area that's got plenty of fresh water availability, but we might do it in an area that's under water stress. And then compare this map on the left with the map on the right. And this is the temporal component to our contextualizing. So there on the left is water stress in May, and on the right, water stress in October. And those of you familiar with the region will know that corresponds obviously to rainfall patterns. So this is one thing that we really need to consider when we're coming up with these methods and metrics and trying to put them in the hands of policymakers, is that we're going to have to contextualize them. And that's an area that I think hasn't been done adequately so far. So it's up to the research community, I think, to come up with these metrics, and we need to make sure that these metrics adequately reflect what we're trying to measure and what we're trying to optimize. Then we need to contextualize these metrics and make sure they're relevant to the area, to the community, to the timescale, to the population. And we need to normalize them. We need benchmarks, we need targets, we need something to compare these impacts, these potential impacts to. Once that's done, I think, to an extent, it's then over to policymakers to prioritize. So we realize that these methods and metrics are going to be important in decision making, but decision makers have a lot of other things to consider. But perhaps something that we haven't done very well so far is listen to those decision makers and those policy makers and actually feedback from them into which methods and which metrics need more attention. So I'd just like to thank everyone in the working group for all their contributions so far. And then I think we're going to open it up now for the discussion to all of those attending the consultation meeting. Thank you.